All right, we're going to ask this question. Why? Why did John write Revelation besides the God told him, right? And so we have to look at a couple of things here. And so to find that answer, we should analyze the structure of a book. So I'm trying to think of a good example of this. When people write argumentatively, they generally have a structure to what they're writing, and the reason why they're writing is usually found by analyzing. So I do this with sermons because I've been trained to do it with sermons. It's not always good, but like I'll write down as they're speaking to try to find their main point if it's not obvious. And you should be able to do that. And so we can do that with Revelation, looking at what his main points are and stuff. The problem is it's very difficult because, well, now I should say this, like there's some books like Romans is very well structured. It's very clear. Paul is a trained rhetorician. I don't know what he's a trained speaker. Let's go with that. So. Okay, all right, that's fine. And so Paul is really easy to kind of figure out what his arguments are. John in general, like if you even read the Gospels, like there's structure to the Gospel, but then you get to the letters, and we went through the letters, and sometimes it's hard to kind of figure out what he's trying to say because of the way he writes it. And Revelation is much in the same way. And so we have to kind of look at the structure and try to figure out what main voices are. You don't want a squeaky chair, huh? All right. So there's going to be several questions that we have to figure out for John's purpose. The first thing we have to ask is, what is the purpose of Revelation 1:19? So if someone will open up their Bibles and read 1:19. All right. Right therefore, what you've seen, what is now, and what will take place. Now, nearly every commentator agrees that this is an important verse. The question is, why? Why is it important? And that's where everybody starts to diverge. It's an important verse. We don't know why. Okay, that's the simple answer. All right, so here, one group says that this is a template for Revelation. I'm not to the handout yet, or maybe I am. I don't know. No, I'm not to the handout yet. All right. So one says that maybe it's a template for Revelation. We do have 3 clauses here, right? What are the 3 clauses? Right? Past, present, and future. All right, and so if we have these 3 clauses, what was, what is, and what will be, right? Like God is the God who was and is to come. All right, so maybe these 3 clauses are indicative of how John is writing this book. And so they would argue that Revelation 1 is what is, Revelation 2 to 3 is, Revelation 1 is what was, Revelation 2 and 3, which are the letters to the churches, is what is present, and Revelation 4 through 22 is the future. All right. Now here's the problem. What did we? This is a letter, and what do letters have? What is the purpose of a letter? Sorry, let me ask a better question. Yeah, to teach something to those people, right? If I'm receiving a letter, I'm hoping they're talking to me and not my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, right? And so if we say that Revelation, 4 through 22 is all future, then that means just 1 to 3 means something to the original audience, right? And so it relegates most of Revelation to insignificance to the original audience, and I just have problems doing that. If it's a letter, it has to mean something to them. And so we have to gotta recognize that. Another view says that 119 is actually a restatement of 111. So if someone wants to read 111.
Which said, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the seven churches. To Ephesus, Smyrna,
I don't have my Bible in front of me.
Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea.
Laodicea. We'll memorize those later. You're not going to use those in the future? Sorry, I need to open. I didn't copy this verse down. Okay. So in 111, there are some different words here. He's commanded to write what you see. And so if 119 is simply restating, then we're left with two clauses, the present and the future. And so what this is arguing is we should not see three tenses, but rather just two tenses, a present and a future tense. And again, it's part of this is a language thing, okay? So again, some of this is applied differently depending on who's talking here. Some people say 1 through 3 is present, whereas 4 through 22 is future. Again, it comes to the same problem as saying, okay, well, all you've done is moved the past into the present, chapter 1, right? You've done the same thing. And so it's really not that different from the first view. However, there is a construction in Greek, okay? The construction kai. It's translated and, but we can translate it in different ways. It can be translated as both and, okay? And so if we read 119 again, we could translate it this way, and we could say, write, therefore, what you've seen. We don't see it in the English. It says, and what is now, and what will be. Okay, so two kais. If there's two kais, both and. Okay, and so we could see this being, you're therefore supposed to write what you've seen. That's already stated in 111, right? And then he says, what is now and what's going to be, both and. And these people say these are one thing, the present and the future is how we can read that. Now this does have some appealing things to it because in the New Testament we have this idea called now but not yet. Okay, and we see it quite often in the New Testament if we're looking for it. We have salvation now, but not yet, right? We're saved from our sins now, but not fully until Jesus comes back. Realized eschatology is sometimes what it's called. The New Testament writers believe they were living in the end times, right? And so we get the benefits of end time stuff now, and then when Jesus comes back, we get it fully realized. Okay, realized eschatology is generally the term for it. And we see it all the time. Again, we see it all the time. The kingdom of God is now, but it's not fully ushered in, right? Like we're not living with God present with us, as we'll see at the end of Revelation. And so we see this. And so maybe there's some appealing things to this second part of it, okay? If we take it as just one idea, it's both present and future, and everything that John's going to write is one concept. Now, what's happening now, what's going to happen. We can see this now but not yet idea. And so it still would have meaning for the original audience. All right. Yeah. Now, not yet eschatology. So realized is the technical term. Verse 3, or the third option is to view 119 again as restating 111, which we've just talked about how that would work. Wait, I don't know why I have this. I'm repeating myself here. That's the same thing as what I just said up here, so ignore that. The fourth way is that this is a genre formula. Okay? So we already mentioned that there's 3 genres in Revelation. Do you guys remember what they are? Yes. Letter, prophecy, and apocalypse. Letter, prophecy, and apocalypse. Say that with me 3 times. Letter? No, just kidding. I'm just kidding. Letter, prophecy, and apocalypse. And so they have to do, this is all I'm going to say about this. There's a lot of mental gymnastics to make this say that this is a letter, prophecy, and apocalypse. And so I'll just leave it there because that's really all you really care about. Another one is and then this is one that I think is going to be probably a better option. This gets us to our handout here. We need to recognize Daniel's influence within Revelation. And so if we are to look at Daniel 2.
I read that this week too.
Oh, there you go. If you look at Daniel 2, it says, and I added some Greek words there and highlighted them so that it could stand out here. It says, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dreams and visions that have passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron and the bronze clay, the silver and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and it's trustworthy, and its interpretation is trustworthy. All right, so there's some Greek phrases there. Adelose, ha de genestai, and hosa de genestai. In Revelation 1:1, we have that it's a different form, but that dexai is the same word as that first one up there, okay? The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God has shown to him, that same word, okay? His servant, what must soon take place, same phrase. It does include an extra added in texai, okay? And then he has made it known by sending his angel. Then in 119, we get a lot of the same word phrases. Right, therefore, what you've seen, what is now, what will take place later. And there, again, the Greek changes it, but it's the same words, okay? After this, which is metatauta, I looked, Revelation 4:1, and there before me was a door saying in heaven, and a voice I first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show, okay, same word we see in Daniel 2, you what must take place after these things, metatauta again. And then Revelation 22:6, the angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true. The Lord, the God who inspires the prophets, sent his angels to show, same word, his servant, the things that must take place. And again, we have the same phrasing, okay? And so we need to recognize that there's a repetition of phrases at key moments in Revelation. And if there's repetition, what does that tell us? It's important. We should listen to it, okay? And so we need to recognize that Daniel definitely has some things. Now there is some differences that we do have to kind of talk about. And interestingly, the differences from the... Okay, so in the Greek Old Testament, I shouldn't say this with Daniel. Daniel's not true. Daniel would have been written in what languages? Hebrew and Aramaic. He is written in, Aramaic is in there, so we do have to recognize that. And so when I give these Greek, what I'm giving you is the Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint, right? The Septuagint is usually, it just means 70. There were 70 guys that worked together to translate from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek, and so that's the Roman numerals for 70. Okay, so just in case. Okay, and so we call this the Septuagint. It's the one that we use a lot of the New Testament when they quote Old Testament scriptures, they're quoting the Septuagint almost word for word. That's not always the case, but it seems to be more often than not the case. And so we would say that this is the Greek Bible of Paul and the rest of the first Christians. But it's not always true. Sometimes they just randomly do things and we're like, oh, don't know what they're doing here or how they got this. And so they were probably not. So in English, how many translations do we have in English now? A bunch, okay? It's a great answer, okay? And we could probably say the same thing. There was one big one that we know of, but there were a bunch of other ones too, okay? There's a guy by the name of Theodosius. I misspelled his name, I'm sure. Here you go. If you really want to know how to spell it, it's right there. Theodosian. All right. He is a Jewish scholar who translated just a little bit after Revelation would have been written. And one of the things that he does is he, instead of translating like the way the Septuagint does, he adds this meta tauta that is marked up a couple of times on your things at the end. After he writes his stuff, Christians start quoting that rather than the Septuagint because they thought it was better. Okay? And so more than likely, he didn't just come up with it himself. He probably edited another version. And so there's at least one, we could probably suggest that there's at least a Greek version, not the Septuagint, that includes this in Daniel. And so when, even though the Septuagint doesn't have it, we can probably assume that it was still a acceptable translation of Daniel. And so when that comes to the fore, we can see even more clearly how much Daniel influenced Revelation. And so when it comes to 119, yeah, it's important, but it's important as a marker within the book. And so what I'm going to argue is these four are key markers of Revelation that we should pay attention to. So 1:1 would be an introduction, and it corresponds also with 22:6, because when you get to 22:6, it's the conclusion. Like everything that happens from 22:6 onward is just John wrapping up everything that he's just talked about. And so from 1:1 to 119 is kind of a introduction, and then from 119 until 4:1, you have another section, and then from 4:1 until 22:6, there's a large section. Okay, so it's just so 119 is important, but it's important in the fact of it's a part of this bigger scheme that John is doing. And so it's not necessarily the key verse, all right? That's what I would argue in here. It's still an important verse, though. Oh, yeah, there you go. 119 is a marker. It's a transition. All right, so now we have to kind of dive into the structure, all right, and how the different parts of Revelation work together. And so that's the big stapled one. We might get through it all. Otherwise, bring this back next week if we don't get through it all. All right, so when we look at Revelation, we do need to, again, map out any piece of literature, because in doing so, we are able to find arguments that are being made. In Revelation, there's not much markers, but almost everybody agrees on these 6 elements, okay? 1:1 through 8 is a prologue or an introduction to a letter. 1:9 through 3:22 is a discussion to the 7 churches, okay? This is where he starts saying to the churches, and he starts writing to them. 4:1 through 8:1, we have 7 seals. 8:2 through 11:19, we have 7 trumpets. 12:1 through 14:20, we have 7 signs. 15:1 through 16:21, we have 7 bowls. You see 7 popping up quite a bit? Yeah, ignore that for a second. We'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah, no, you're good. We'll get there. Sorry. It's in 2 more slides. So, okay, so they generally agree on these things. The big problem is once we get to 17:1, we don't know what's going on. Like it fits into these things, and then we get to 17:1, we're like, who knows? All right, and so we have to kind of figure out that. What is happening in 17 through 22? And there's lots of disagreements. Surprise, surprise, right? There's a guy by the name of G.H. Giblin who notes the similarities between 17:1 and 21:9. So if you read those two verses, they're very similar. One of the seven angels who had the seven bulls said to me, "Come, and I'll show you the punishments of the great prostitute who sits on many waters." 17:1. 21:9 says, "One of the seven angels who had the seven bulls full of the seven last plagues came to me and said, 'Come, and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb.'" See the similarities? You have an angel who held a bull, called John to come and see something, and he's showing him a woman, right? The great prostitute, the bride of Christ. Okay? So there's a lot of similarities. And so based on that, we should probably say that those are probably a division, right? Those two are setting off two different visions, and that's probably where we should break it. 17:1 to 21:8, and then 21:9 to 22:6 or whatever. Okay? That should be the break. All right, and so then we can here's your handout. Okay, and so we could probably look at we're going to add this to the literal hinges a little bit later, and so we should look at Revelation 1 through 3 being a unit, 4 through 7 being a unit, 8 through 11:14 being a unit, 11:15 through 14:20 being a unit, 15 through 16 being a unit, and then the 17 through 21 is probably a unit. But we can also divide it into two spots. And then we get the last. Now, again, this is our construct. This may not be what John actually did. But if it is our construct, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 big units. Or 8, depending on how we want to break this up. Okay. And again, this is our construct. It doesn't necessarily mean that it works. All right, so we do have to decide if it's 7 or 8. If it's 7, awesome. It fits with what John's doing. However, if it is 8, 8 is another important number. It's the number of Jesus, the number of the new creation in early Christian writings. We say that God rested on the 7th day, and on the 8th day, Jesus rose from the dead, okay? But there's only 7 days, so we celebrate on the first day, right? But in early Christian writings, they would often use that 8th day being Jesus' resurrection. Okay, this is probably a good overall arching structure, if we can think of it that way. The real question becomes, how do the individual parts relate to each other? Okay.
What's that called whenever the Jewish writers would put two stories? It's not a theme. They put two stories that were kind of opposite together, and you could see a picture. That kind of anyway. I can't think of the word for it, but that kind of sounds like what he was doing with the prostitute, and then the bride of Christ is just showing an overall picture, because at one extreme would be prostitute. I think that's what it is, but that's what they call it in the Old Testament, Jezebel.
This is what I'm going to call her. When you finally get to that in 17, like everything that's talked about are all the ways the Jewish talked about Jezebel, and so Jezebel is just the easy way of doing it.
I think Ishtar is the Mesopotamian way of talking about Jezebel.
Probably. Maybe. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. What we're going to constantly see is this divide between the world, the worldly way of doing things versus God's way, right? And so you have this dichotomy between these two ideas. All right, you're either going to be here or you're going to be here, and that's kind of what John's doing in this, especially in that last section. Dichotomy is two opposite ideas, and so we do have to recognize this. All right, so the question again comes to, how do all of these parts fit in, right? Like, how do the trumpets? Everybody knows that there's three major judgments in Revelation, right? There's the trumpets, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. And so how do they all fit in? That's really, how do they work together? What are their purposes and all that stuff? And that really becomes the key point to figuring out, why does John write? It's based on how those parts fit together. And so we're to kind of wrap this up, we're going to try to talk about this. So the futurist view, which we've talked about the futurist view and the problems that I have with it, but in the futurist view, the Revelation 4 through 22 is successive. And what they mean is, once you get to 4, and you get to 22, that's the order that's going to happen. It's going to be 4, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7, and then 8, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that's interesting is when you get to the 7th seal, there's some quiet, and then it introduces the trumpets. And when you get to the 7th trumpet, there's some quiet, and then it introduces the bowls. All right, and so the way that futurists often view it is that each part progressively takes place at the same time. And so the 7th seal begins the 7th trumpet. And so if you look at the second handout I gave you, if I can find my second handout. I thought I had it right here. Anyway, I have it right here. You'll see that it goes seals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then drops down to trumpets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then drops down to the bowls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now there are some variations, and that's what this next one is. Some see them as taking part progressively at the same time. And so instead of reading this as 4 through 22 being chronological, they would read 4 through, I don't know where they stop, 7, 8, I don't know. And then 9 through 11, and then 12 through 17 or 16. And so that some of these things are happening at the same time instead of being progressively there. And so that's what that next chart looks at is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 being spaced out. And then the trumpets are a little bit less spaced out, and then the bowls are tightly together. All right. Another way of viewing this is that the 7th element are all the same, but that the rest are progressive. And so that is that next box picture. So you see it goes seal 1 through 6, then you skip the 7th seal, go to trumpet 1 through 6, and then you skip the 7th trumpet and get to the bowls, and then the last one's all there together. Okay? Now, what's very interesting is that there's some problems with this. All right? And some of the problems is if it's happening one right after the other, then we have some issues, right? So in the first judgments, a fourth of the world dies. And then the next set of judgments, a third of the world dies. And then a half of the world dies. And so we have to ask, okay, so if I think somebody wrote it out, and I don't know if I have it here. Essentially, you get left with very little people on the earth when Jesus returns, is what you get down to, depending on how you even read it, right? Either everyone's dead or it's a very, very small number compared to where we're at right now, right? So if there's 10 billion people right now, a fourth would be 2.5, so you're at 7.5 billion, and then a third of that drives it even down, and half of that, and there's a couple of places where it happens like that. So you do have some issues. Interestingly, the last ones, the whole world is affected. There's actually a fourth set of 7 judgments that aren't actually recorded, and it's the judgments of the thunders. All right, when we get there, we'll have to talk about that. And so where you get a fourth and then a third, the next one you would expect is a half, but it jumps to a whole. And the reason it jumps to a whole is because the thunders are not recorded, and the thunders are where you're probably expecting those half to be. And so we have some issues there. All right, so that's one way to look at it. Another way is what's called progressive recapitulation or parallelism, whichever one's easier for you to say. All right. This is where the repetition of judgment, salvation, conclusions appear. All right, and so if you look closely at a couple of passages, 6, 12 through 17, 11, 18, and 14 through 20, there's a lot of similarities in how they relate to the next part of the book. In fact, there's an intensification. One of the things we see this very clearly at the very end, or at the very beginning of chapter 4, you have a picture of God, right? And what does it say is happening around God, beyond the people? It says there were peals of thunder, flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder, right? We sing it. That's the only reason I know those three. And then at the end of at the end of the seal, those things come up again, and it's intensified. And then after the trumpets, they appear again and intensify. And when you get to the end of the bowls, last bowl, it appears again as an intensify. And so something happens in repetition. What does that mean? It's important. Pay attention. And so if we recognize that they're all the same, they're just an intensification, and we recognize that there's definitely been an intensification of each part, right? A fourth, a third, a whole are judged, then maybe we shouldn't read this as this way. The futurists do it, but maybe it's what John's doing is talking about the same event over and over again. That's what recapitulation says. Okay. Let me see here. And so that's what there are other examples of this. The structural patterns are repeated in variety, and that's kind of the handout. So if you look at that next page, I think you have like the seals, trumpets, and bowls, and you see similarities across those different areas. There also seems to there's a lot of interesting similarities between all of this, okay? Another thing we should recognize is that there's also a chiastic structure to this. And so I think there's a whole nother page that shows the chiastic. So a chiasm is, looks like an X, right? And generally, when we have chiastic, we say A, B, C, B prime, A prime, right? And anytime you have a structure like this, what's the most important part? The middle. So whatever the middle is, that's the most important part. And so there is somewhat of a chiastic structure. And the middle of that chiastic structure is the War of the Ages. I'm assuming you guys have this in your handout. Yeah, okay, good, okay. And so, yeah, so maybe that is the most important part of Revelation. What we should get out is the War of the Ages, which makes a lot of sense because what John is going to do is this battle between Jezebel and the bride, God's people versus not God's people, and that's really a discussion of the War of the Ages. Who are we going to follow? Which God are we going to put on the throne? The one that's already sitting there or the one that pretends? And in that section, that's the section where you have the dragon and the beast imitating God, right? I mean, they're trying to make it. And so I think we can look at that and see that structure. There's other repetitive things, such as 3.5 years. It was repeated over and over and over again. So how many 3.5 years are there? It's a question we got to ask. Or are we talking about the same thing? Okay. There's at least 4 that are mentioned, and we get maybe a 10.5 year period instead of what we think. So maybe not chronological. We also have this phrase, gather them for war, which is repeated 3 times, 16:4, 19:19, and 28. Are there 3 different wars, or are we talking about one event? Okay, those are questions that we have to ask. We also have to recognize that each time there's an enhancement, right? Judgment on Babylon, they gather for war. Judgment against the beast, there's a gathering for war. Judgment against Satan, there's a gathering for war. Okay. We also have battle imagery, 19:17 through 18 and 28 through 9. All these wordings come from Ezekiel 39. And if we recognize that 28 through 9 seems to supplement 19:17 to 21, then we can see how John is using the old context for just one idea, one battle. There's also this refrain about the fall of Babylon that appears, I can list them all for you, but it appears a lot. And these certainly are not sequential, but rather a cataclysmic event. Okay? Another thing we need to recognize is that there are a relationship between the letters and the rest of the book. So when we read chapters 2 to 3, it sets the tone for everything else that's going to be read. Okay? I don't know. I don't know if I gave this to you, but for example, there's a talk about false synagogue in 2:9 and 3:9, which is then contrasted to the throne room of God, right? What is this? The synagogue was an imitation of the temple, which was an imitation of, you say tabernacle? Okay, which is then an imitation of heaven. Yes, heaven. Moses saw a vision in heaven, built the tabernacle, and everything imitated that, right? And so the false synagogue compared to the real synagogue, where God is, okay? We have a contrast there. In the false synagogue, they oppose the Lamb, but what's happening in the real synagogue? The Lamb is worshipped, right? There's also persecution and martyrdom that's portrayed in the letters. Smyrna will face a 10-day trial, which ironically is what the martyrs do in 6:9 through 17. Philadelphia is promised spiritual protection, which is seen in the sealing of the 144,000 in chapter 7. And this sealing is done with the divine mark, something that is promised to both Philadelphia and Pergamum. Pergamum is warned about a false prophet and satanic king, which appear in the beasts. And so we have these happening over and over again. Jezebel is mentioned in the church of Thyatira, which is why I would call the prostitute Jezebel, because she's already mentioned. And we see other links, okay? And so we just have to recognize those. Oh, I think I gave that to you. Did I give that to you? Hey, sweet. I was just reading it off for no reason. Okay, cool. Thanks for helping me out, guys. All right. Sorry. You're good. Okay. And then again, we do need to recognize that Daniel 2 is important for Revelation as a whole. Daniel had 5 synchronous visions. And so in Daniel, when you read Daniel 2, and then Daniel 7, and then Daniel 8, and Daniel 9, and then Daniel 10 through 12, you don't think of 5 different events. They're all the same thing, just talked about in different ways. Okay? And so if Daniel 2 is that important for Revelation, then maybe John is trying to recapture that. Okay? And so that very last page on there, I think this is probably the appropriate way to read Revelation. And I'll let you guys analyze it later, so I'm not going to sit there and analyze. But we probably should look at as probably what he meant to do. What's interesting there that I do want to just point out is in 1:9 through 3:22, what you see is a church imperfect in the world, and that is fulfilled at the very end when you see the church perfected in glory. And everything that happens in between is just talking about that struggle to some extent. Okay, I want to kind of get through this, so I'm going to go a little bit faster. Let's talk just about some themes. That way we can actually get into the book, right? Okay. Some themes that are happening throughout this. You have suffering and victory. Okay. This is not on the handouts. So one of the things that you'll see in Revelation is the theme of the Lamb's victory over Satan. But how does the Lamb gain that victory? Through suffering, right? The Lamb appears, and how does he appear in chapter 4? Slain. All right, he's a slain lamb. And so the Lamb gains victory over Satan by his suffering. All right? In the same way, the church, you're going to see over and over again in Revelation, gains victory, but how do we gain victory? Through suffering. Okay, so we're going to see that. Conversely, those who persecute God's people are just piling judgment up on themselves. And so then the question is, are you suffering or doing the suffering? Right? Are you persecuting or being persecuted? All right? And so what John is calling Christians to do is to overcome the suffering and not compromise. Another thing we're going to see is the throne of God, which really appears in Revelation 4 through 5. And in the throne of God, we see that God is the center of creation, and he alone is worthy of worship. Everything else in the book, after chapters 4 and 5, stems from what happens in chapters 4 and 5. All right? We also see a contest by beasts for sovereignty. So the beasts that come out of the sea, they are there trying to gain sovereignty against God. Okay? We also see a call to worship before the sovereign God. And one thing that's very important is that God is never not seen on his throne. So anytime God appears in Revelation, he is always sitting down on his throne. To him who sits on the throne forever and ever. Amen. Another idea is the new creation. Again, this is the now, not yet of the New Testament, and it's culminated ultimately in the final passages, chapters 21 through 22. And John points to the new creation as the reason why we should overcome. Okay? Why should you overcome? Because a new creation is coming. And God is making all things new. Jessica's writing some things down. Okay. All right. Next, we also see the place of Christians in this world, and this is a big one throughout the book, okay? The sovereignty of God in Christ in redeeming and judging brings them glory, which is intended to motivate saints to worship God and reflect his glorious attributes through obedience to his word. That's a big statement that just says that throughout Revelation, we're going to see the glory of God, and that glory of God is meant to encourage us to imitate it, okay? There's several places where we see this. Chapters 4 through 5, chapter 7, 9 through 12, chapter 11, 15 through 19, chapter 15, 2 through 8, and chapter 19, 1 through 8. Idolatry in Revelation is not just worshiping other gods, but it's a failure to worship the true God. And so we're going to see that here. And so the struggle for Christians is to see God's real presence in our world. Would you agree with that? And it's not a new struggle. I mean, John's writing this, and they're struggling to see how can evil be winning and God be here and present. And so we're going to see that. And so what we have here is we have both here and in the heavenly places. The church is in both spots right now. All right, and so we have this now but not yet that's still taking place. And so our place in the world, again, is not to compromise, but to bring God honor and glory the way that he deserved it. Deserves it. I shouldn't say deserved it. Deserves. Okay? Okay. So those are just some of the themes that we should keep in the back of our mind. All right. I know I went fast today. I wanted to get done with this so we can actually jump into stuff. So I'm ready to jump in. Yeah, I am tired of introduction. Okay. All right. So here's some things. Conclusions. Reading Revelation is not easy. if it has not been clear yet. You're going to get stumped, but hopefully together we'll find our way through. So remember, always, it meant something to John's original audience. And we got to kind of figure out what that was first to be able to understand what it means for us today. I am going to give you homework. All right, here's your homework. Read Revelation in one sitting. Okay? Open up your Bible app, have it read it to you. What's that? Yeah, you read it. Have the Bible app. The Bible app will read it to you. You can get it in the British version or the English version or American version. Okay, I like the British guy better, but you can do whatever you want to do.
On the NIV?
Yep, I did NIV. Yeah, I did NIV. You can set the speed. You don't have to listen to how slow he talks normally. Okay, you can speed it up. I sped it up just a little bit, and it takes less than an hour. So sometime this week. Remember, Revelation was meant to be read orally. You're supposed to hear it first. All right, and doing it in one sitting is how it was meant to be. And so I just encourage you this week to do it how it was meant to be, and listen for the repetitions, listen for the themes that keep appearing throughout. All right, it's a simple homework, hopefully.